back into the training an hour and a half late, and Marilyn took me over to the corner, and she didn't do Traeger, she did craniosacral. And it really was the craniosacral, I feel, that helped me heal from, my nervous system heal from that insult, as well as, you know, a lifetime of wear and tear and the original fracture, etc.
It's a strong personal experience for you.
Yeah.
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 It sounds that way. And then how much longer was it after that that you began to study it yourself?
It was that following spring. It
Uh-huh.
was, wait a minute. No, it was the following fall. It was in the fall of '85, because I had to finish the Traeger training, and as quickly as I got my Traeger practitioner status in the fall of '85, that, you know, September, October, November, I was the first in a series of Body Masters trainings that Marilyn Krieger taught. Marilyn was an interesting character. She was a psychologist that worked in the prisons system in Minnesota, and she was in the prisons, I think, for over a decade, when she came to the conclusion that her verbal therapy wasn't reaching the inmates the way she wanted to reach them. And so she started studying bodywork. Became very, very highly talented. When I was studying with her in the early '80s, mid '80s, she was working almost exclusively with cerebral palsy, quadriplegics, paraplegics. She was one of the co-developers of what I would call the advanced work of Traeger, which is called reflex response work, where you're finding the very, very, very minute muscles that we think we don't have anymore in a paraplegic or quadriplegic, and then teaching them how to work with that. So I was trained in that work early. That was part of her Body Masters series that she included the cranial in. And then I was fortunate enough to, in '86 through '88, work with her doing four-handed work almost weekly for over 2 years. So it's almost like an apprenticeship.
Yeah.
In addition to doing really in-depth training up through what would be called the advanced work with the what Upledger terms the somato-emotional release and unwinding work.
Talk a little bit about what it means to be a kinesthetic empath.
Right. So with a kinesthetic empath, kines is movement or body, empath is empathy. So a kinesthetic empath, essentially what that means is I had to learn how to not feel your pain in my body. It really wasn't an issue until I became a massage therapist. The first spring after I finished my certification process through the massage school, I had to do some really deep listening to myself.
Right.
To learn how to shift modes of operation that I had learned. A lot of would be termed third chakra issues, a lot of interpersonal issues, a lot of working with my own identity, so that I could tell the difference between my pain and your pain. Another piece that we had talked about in preparation for the interview was other modalities, wanting to compare the work or show the difference between this work and other works. And someone might say, what do you think about chiropractic? Or what do you think about this type of massage? Or what do you think about acupuncture? And what do you think about surgery? You know, and actually the psychologist that diagnosed my dyslexia and started my brain rehabbing, my rehab for my brain injury, was the first person that told me about research done in the 70s in Japan largely, where they were able to show that when the surgeon is aware of where the meridians are, they won't sever the meridians. When the surgeon isn't aware and isn't intentional with their scalpel, they're far more likely to create scar tissue and sever the meridians, the acupuncture meridians. Again, you know, what do you think about massage? What do you think about chiropractic? I think what my bottom line is, whether you call it craniosacral therapy or whether you call it Swedish massage, whether you call it chiropractic or whether you call it Rolfing, if the practitioner, you call it surgery, the practitioner is coming from a heart-centered place, the body is far more likely to take it as receive that as a healing or as a correction than if the individual if the practitioner isn't coming from a loving place.
And I remember that we had a previous conversation in which you told me about some information related to the HeartMath Institute, and it sounds like what you're talking about is some of the research that they do. Right.
About the same time as I started studying craniosacral therapy, one of the things that Marilyn was teaching us was an art form called Kino Nani, which is a Hawaiian form. One of her teachers was from Hawaii, and this individual brings paraplegics and quadriplegics back to being ambulatory, and it was all a technique that she developed in rebuilding the sensitivity and musculature in her face after she had been assaulted. And so essentially it was the class was taught as a non-surgical facelift, but what it really was almost a meditation of being able to do the heart work. And so from the mid-'80s, and also some of the other training that I had from the mid-'80s that I took at the same time as the craniosacral, it really was looking at the heart's entrainment and the feeling of fulfillment and gratitude, love, while we're working.
Isn't there a way to actually measure that? That if you experience that when you're working, and the recipient is experiencing that, there's actually a way to measure that process? Yeah,
one of the things that we connected with one of the earlier researchers for the HeartMath Institute in 1989. He was all excited about maybe doing some research, and that did never happen, but that was when we first plugged into understanding about what the HeartMath Institute was doing. And what they're doing is teaching techniques that help the individual stay in or go back to a state of coherent emotion. And what they mean by coherent emotion is simply to be able to, at will, take a deep breath and move back into appreciation, gratitude, a resonance frequency that is harmonious.
And whole.
And whole. And in measuring that, our modern science uses terms like phase lock and entrainment. And what we're talking about there is the heart itself has an electromagnetic frequency of 12,000 times anything else in the body. So that when we come into that love and compassion or appreciation and gratitude, what happens is all of the other organ systems of the body and all the other structures of the body entrain with it. They all start to vibrate at the same oscillatory rate, electromagnetic rate, or phase lock. Okay. And that actually, interesting enough, that brings us back to a similarity with the craniosacral. Craniosacral therapy, to be able to palpate the craniorhythmic pulse, the individual really has to be able to blend their right and left brain. And one of the right brain skills that comes into that is called blending. In the early 80s, we used to call it melding, but I think that got a little too Trekkie. So they're, I think, currently calling it blending. And what that is while we're palpating structures, I lose the ability to tell where my hand ends and you begin. There's a blending that amplifies the movement of the recipient in their body in my hands. And as long as the body is in that self-corrective still point stage, which I guess we need to clarify that too, that is occurring, that melding is happening. Back up just a little bit. In relationship to the still point, we talked about palpating the craniorhythmic pulse like watching the ripples on a still pond. So you're not only watching the surface, but you're feeling for the rocks and the boulders and the snags on the bottom of the pond. When it is that the practitioner finds what would be called a primary restriction, and we go to work there, wherever it is in the body, the craniorhythmic pulse will go into a still point if that's significant. John Upledger calls that the significance indicator, or the interphysician. So the interphysician is a significance indicator, and that's how I know I'm doing any good.
Okay.
Because as soon as, so I feel like I've palpated something going on in your neck. And so I go to work with your neck, and as soon as my hands are in the appropriate place and my intention is clear, you're going to go into what's called a still point. And the still point is the body's self-corrective phase. It's kind of like rebooting your computer. Okay. No craniorhythmic pulse at that time. And when the craniorhythmic pulse resumes, then the release is complete. That phase is done, and we're on to the next still. Eventually, the work often ends up just being a series of either greater and greater still points or less dramatic still points, depending on how much correction the individual is able to sustain.